Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling economics, diving into some of the core principles and concepts you've been curious about.
Okay.
From what I'm seeing, your sources touch on everything from the basics of supply and demand to those head-scratching paradoxes like
Yeah.
the diamond water thing. Plus, there's some stuff about shrinkflation, which always makes me feel a little cheated, but maybe there's more to it than meets the eye. Ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's unravel those economic mysteries.
Perfect. So looking at your sources, I see a lot about value propositions, USPs, and those value statement things.
Yeah.
It seems like companies spend a lot of time trying to figure out what makes them special.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
A company's value proposition is their core promise to the customer, what they're offering in exchange for your hard-earned money. Their unique selling proposition, the USP, is that special sauce that sets them apart from the competition. Think of it as their secret weapon in the marketplace. And the value statement, that's like their moral compass guiding their actions and outlining their core beliefs.
So it's not just about making a buck, it's about defining what they bring to the table and how they want to impact the world. I'm also seeing some stuff about arbitrage. It sounds a bit like financial wizardry.
Arbitrage is about spotting price differences and capitalizing on them.
Okay.
Think of it like this. You find a rare comic book at a flea market for a steal, and then you sell it online for a much higher price.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So arbitrageurs are basically bridging the gap between different markets, buying low and selling high. But is that always ethical? One of your articles talked about the ethics of reselling limited edition sneakers for inflated prices. Where's the line between smart business and taking advantage of people?
That's a great question, and it highlights the ethical considerations that can arise in various economic activities. While arbitrage in its purest form helps to balance prices across markets, there are instances where it can lead to questions about fairness and accessibility.
Now, another concept that keeps popping up in your sources is the production possibility curve, or PPC, along with this thing called opportunity cost. It sounds like we're about to get all graphical up in here.
Imagine a country that can produce either cars or computers. The PPC shows all the different combinations of cars and computers they could make with their limited resources. The key takeaway is that producing more of one thing means producing less of the other.
So it's like choosing between two delicious desserts, and the one you don't choose is the opportunity cost, right?
It's the value of what you have to give up to get something else. Every decision has an opportunity cost, and the PPC helps us visualize those trade-offs. That leads us nicely into the concept of comparative advantage.
Ah, yes, comparative advantage. It rings a bell from my economics class. Something about specializing in what you're good at. Does it have to do with international trade?
Absolutely. It suggests that countries should focus on producing and exporting goods and services they can create more efficiently than other countries. It's not about being the best at everything, but rather being relatively better at something. For example, if one country can produce both coffee and bananas more efficiently than another, they should still specialize in whichever they're most efficient at and then trade with the other country.
So even if a country is a jack of all trades, they should still pick a lane and focus on their superstar product. It's better to focus on your strengths and let someone else handle the rest.
That's a great analogy. Comparative advantage leads to greater efficiency and overall economic well-being, and it helps explain why countries specialize in certain industries and trade with each other.
It's like a global potluck where everyone brings their best dish. Now, shifting gears a bit, your sources also mention different economic systems like command economies and free markets. What gets produced in these different systems? Is it like a giant game of economic SimCity?
In a command economy, the government is the main player calling the shots on production prices and resource allocation. It's a top-down approach where the government acts as the central planner.
So it's like a super organized system where the government decides what everyone gets. But what about free market economies? Is it a free-for-all out there?
While individuals and businesses have more autonomy in a free market economy, the system relies on voluntary exchange where buyers and sellers interact freely, driven by their own self-interest.
So it's like a giant dance between supply and demand, where prices act as signals guiding those interactions.
Yeah.
But what happens when things get out of sync? Like when demand for something explodes, but the supply can't keep up.
That's when we see the effects of market forces in action. When demand outstrips supply, we get shortages, and prices tend to rise as people compete for limited goods. Remember the toilet paper frenzy back in 2020?
Oh, yeah, those were some wild times. Empty shelves and people fighting over the last few rolls. That was a real-life example of a shortage.
Precisely. When supply exceeds demand, we get surpluses, and prices usually drop to encourage buying. It's all about finding that balance point, the market equilibrium, where supply and demand are in harmony.
Like a tug of war between those two forces trying to find that sweet spot.
Speaking of economic ups and downs, one of your articles talked about recessions. It mentioned something about 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. What exactly does that mean, and what kind of impact can a recession have on people's lives? So, a recession is essentially a period of significant economic decline, a slowdown in economic activity that can last for months or even years. It's typically marked by those 2 consecutive quarters of shrinking GDP, which is a measure of the total value of goods and services produced in a country.
Right.
During a recession, businesses may struggle, leading to job losses, reduced consumer spending, and a general sense of economic uncertainty.
It sounds pretty grim. One of your sources also mentioned different types of unemployment.
Yeah.
It's not just a simple case of people being out of work. There's more to it than that.
You're absolutely right. There are various reasons why people might be unemployed, and understanding the different types can be helpful in addressing the issue. For instance, you have frictional unemployment, which is actually a natural part of a healthy economy. It happens when people are between jobs, maybe they've just graduated or are transitioning to a new career path. Then there's structural unemployment, which occurs when there's a mismatch between the skills workers have and the skills employers are looking for. This can happen due to technological advancements or shifts in the economy, like automation replacing certain jobs.
So it's like the economy is evolving, and some jobs become obsolete while new ones emerge.
What about the kind of unemployment that happens during a recession?
That's called cyclical unemployment, and it's directly tied to those economic downturns.
Okay.
When demand for goods and services falls during a recession, businesses reduce production, leading to layoffs and higher unemployment.
It's like a chain reaction. The economy slows down, people lose their jobs, and then consumer spending drops even further, making the recession worse. Your sources also touched on inflation and deflation.
Right.
These always sound so dramatic, like villains in an economic thriller. What are they, and why should we care about them? Inflation is essentially a general increase in prices over time. It means your money buys less than it did before. Think about it this way. If a loaf of bread costs $2 today, and a year from now it costs $2.50, that's inflation at work.
So it's like the cost of everything is creeping upward, and our money is losing its purchasing power.
Exactly. This erosion of purchasing power can be a real problem, especially for people on fixed incomes or those who aren't seeing their wages keep pace with rising prices. Deflation, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's a general decline in prices.
So everything gets cheaper. That sounds like a good thing.
Deflation can also be problematic. When prices are consistently falling, people tend to put off purchases, expecting prices to drop even further. This can lead to a decrease in demand, which can further slow down the economy and even lead to a deflationary spiral.
It's like a vicious cycle. Prices fall, demand dries up, businesses suffer, and the economy stalls. But why do economies go through these ups and downs in the first place? Are we just at the mercy of these mysterious forces?
Economies naturally go through cycles of boom and bust, often referred to as business cycles. These fluctuations are influenced by factors from consumer confidence and business investment to government policies and global events.
It's like the economy has a mind of its own going through mood swings. But speaking of government policies, I'm seeing some stuff in your sources about fiscal policy and monetary policy. It sounds like the government and central banks have some levers they can pull to try and steer the economy in the right direction.
You got it. Fiscal policy refers to the government's use of spending and taxes to influence the economy. When the government wants to stimulate economic growth, it can increase spending or cut taxes, putting more money into people's pockets and encouraging businesses to invest. This is known as expansionary fiscal policy.
What about when they want to cool things down, like when inflation is getting out of hand?
That's when contractionary fiscal policy comes into play. The government might reduce spending or raise taxes to slow down the economy and curb inflation.
It's like tapping the brakes to prevent things from overheating. Does that fit into the picture?
Monetary policy is controlled by central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the U.S. They focus on managing the money supply and interest rates to influence the economy.
So they're controlling the flow of money in the economy.
Exactly. They have various tools at their disposal.
Okay.
One is adjusting bank reserve requirements, which dictates how much money banks have to keep on hand versus how much they can lend out. Another tool is the discount rate, which is the interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow money from the central bank. By manipulating these rates, they can encourage or discourage borrowing and lending, influencing the overall money supply.
Okay, so they can make it easier or harder for banks to access money, which then trickles down to businesses and consumers. It's all connected. But I'm also seeing something about quantitative easing, or QE. What's that all about?
QE is a more unconventional monetary policy tool that central banks use when interest rates are already very low and they need to stimulate the economy further. It involves injecting money directly into the economy by buying assets like government bonds.
It's like creating more money and using it to buy financial assets.
The goal is to increase the money supply, lower long-term interest rates, and encourage lending and investment.
It's like giving the economy a financial boost when traditional methods aren't enough. But we've been talking a lot about big picture stuff, governments, central banks, and the overall economy. What about us as individuals? How can we make smart economic choices in our own lives?
That's where understanding concepts like marginal analysis and the substitution effect can be helpful.
Marginal analysis, what's that all about?
It's simpler than it sounds. Marginal analysis is all about comparing the extra benefits of doing something with the extra costs. Should I have one more slice of pizza? Should I buy that new gadget? Should I work an extra hour?
So it's like weighing the pros and cons. If the extra benefit outweighs the extra cost, go for it.
Exactly. The substitution effect explains why we tend to buy cheaper alternatives when the price of something we usually buy goes up.
So if the price of my favorite coffee skyrockets, I might switch to a cheaper brand.
Precisely. It's a natural response to price changes. We look for substitutes to satisfy our needs.
Keep seeing these terms, marginal utility and marginal cost. Are those connected to marginal analysis?
Absolutely. Marginal utility is the extra satisfaction you get from consuming one more unit of something. So that first slice of pizza might bring you immense joy, but the fifth slice, maybe not so much.
The joy starts to diminish. And what about marginal cost?
Marginal cost is the additional cost of producing one more unit of something. Businesses use this concept to figure out how much to produce as long as the marginal revenue from selling one more unit is greater than the marginal cost of making it.
It's like finding that sweet spot where profit is maximized. Now, another concept I've come across is elasticity. Does it have to do with how much something can stretch?
Elasticity in economics refers to how sensitive the demand for a product is to changes in its price. For example, if the price of gasoline goes up, people might not drastically reduce their driving because they still need to get to work and run errands. That means demand for gasoline is relatively inelastic.
But if the price of a luxury item like a designer handbag goes up, people might be more likely to hold off on buying it.
Demand for luxury goods tends to be more elastic because people have more flexibility in their choices.
Interesting. So we've talked a lot about how free markets work. Are they always the best way to allocate resources? Do they ever fail to deliver? One of your sources mentioned something called market failures.
That's a great question. While free markets are often efficient at allocating resources, there are instances where they can lead to less than ideal outcomes. These situations are known as market failures.
What are some examples of those fumbles?
One example is when markets fail to provide public goods like national defense or clean air. These goods are non-excludable, meaning it's difficult to prevent people from benefiting from them even if they don't pay. This can lead to a free rider problem, where people benefit without contributing.
I see why that could be a problem. So in those cases, government intervention might be necessary.
Exactly. Governments often step in to provide public goods because private markets might not have enough incentive to do so. Another example of a market failure is the tragedy of the commons.
A tragedy of the commons. That sounds dramatic.
It refers to a situation where shared resources are overused or depleted because individuals act in their own self-interest, even though it ultimately harms.
I remember reading an article you shared about overfishing. Is that an example of the tragedy of the commons?
Absolutely. If every fisherman tries to catch as many fish as possible without any regulations, the fish population could collapse, leading to a decline in the fishing industry and ecological damage.
So it's a case where individual actions driven by short-term gain can have negative consequences for the collective good in the long run.
That's why regulations and sustainable practices are often needed to manage shared resources. Another important concept related to market failures is externalities.
Externalities, what are those?
Externalities occur when the costs or benefits of a transaction spill over onto people who are not directly involved. For example, pollution from a factory is a negative externality because it affects the health and well-being of the surrounding community, even though they're not buying or selling the factory's products.
So the true cost of production isn't reflected in the market price because it doesn't account for those negative impacts on others.
That's why governments often implement policies like pollution taxes or regulations to internalize those costs and encourage more sustainable practices.
It seems like there's a lot more to economics than just supply and demand. It's about understanding these complex interactions, the unintended consequences, and finding ways to create a more balanced and sustainable system. I'm seeing a whole bunch of other interesting economic ideas in your sources, things like the quantity theory of money, The subjective theory of value, fixed costs, variable costs, economies of scale, and even something called shrinkflation.
Right.
Where do we begin with all of this?
Let's start with the quantity theory of money.
Okay.
It's a theory that suggests a direct relationship between the amount of money in circulation and the price level. If you increase the money supply faster than the economy is growing, it can lead to inflation.
So it's like too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly. And this ties back to our discussion about demand pull inflation. The subjective theory of value challenges the idea that the value of something is determined solely by its labor content. Instead, it argues that value is ultimately determined by what people are willing to pay for something based on their individual preferences and perceptions.
It explains why a diamond, which is essentially a shiny rock, can be worth so much more than a gallon of water, which is essential for life. It all boils down to perceived value and scarcity.
Exactly. When it comes to costs, businesses deal with fixed costs and variable costs.
Fixed costs are expenses that don't change, regardless of how much a company produces, like rent or salaries, while variable costs fluctuate depending on production levels like raw materials or energy.
And when a company can lower its average costs by producing more, it's experiencing economies of scale.
So it's like getting a bulk discount for production. The more you make, the cheaper it gets per unit.
It's one of the reasons why larger companies often have a competitive advantage.
Fascinating. And what about shrinkflation? Sounds like a sneaky tactic.
Shrinkflation is when companies reduce the size or quantity of a product while keeping the price the same. It's a way to subtly increase prices without overtly raising them.
So it's like getting less for your money without realizing it.
You might notice that your favorite bag of chips seems a bit lighter, or the candy bar you love is a tad smaller.
I'll definitely be paying closer attention now. So we've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of supply and demand to the complexities of government intervention and market failures. What else do your sources have in store for us?
We've got a few more economic gems to uncover, including game theory, the Pareto principle, and the Laffer Curve.
Sounds like we're in for another wild ride.
Let's dive back in and explore these fascinating concepts.
Okay, so game theory. I'm guessing it's more about strategy than espionage.
You're right. Game theory analyzes how people make decisions in situations where the outcome depends not only on their own choices, but also on the choices of others. It's like playing chess, where you have to anticipate your opponent's moves and plan your own accordingly.
It's about understanding how people interact strategically, whether it's in business, politics, or everyday life.
It helped us predict how people might behave in competitive situations. Now, one of your articles mentioned the Pareto principle, often called the 80-20 rule. What's that all about?
From what I remember, it's the idea that 80% of effects come from 20% of causes. So it's like a small number of things often have a disproportionately large impact.
It can be applied to various aspects of life and business. For instance, 80% of a company's sales might come from 20% of its customers, or 80% of a project's results might be achieved with 20% of the effort.
It's a reminder to focus on those key drivers, those vital few things that really move the needle.
Oh.
I'm also seeing some stuff about fractional reserve banking. How can banks lend out more money than they actually have?
It's a fascinating system. In fractional reserve banking, banks are required to keep only a fraction of their deposits on hand as reserves. The rest can be lent out to borrowers.
So they're creating money by lending out a portion of their deposits, which then become deposits in other banks, which can then be lent out again.
Exactly. This process is called the money multiplier, and it's how banks play a crucial role in expanding the money supply. If too many people try to withdraw their money at the same time, it can lead to a bank run.
That sounds like a recipe for financial panic.
Yeah.
What about the lump of labor fallacy? That sounds like a pretty pessimistic view of the job market.
The lump of labor fallacy is the misconception that there's a fixed amount of work available in the economy. So if one person gets a job, it means someone else loses out.
It's like a zero-sum game where one person's gain is another person's loss.
Exactly. The amount of work in an economy isn't fixed. New jobs can be created through innovation investment and economic growth.
So the pie can actually get bigger, and everyone can potentially benefit. That's a much more optimistic way of looking at things. Another intriguing concept is prospect theory. It has to do with how we perceive gains and losses.
Prospect theory suggests that people are more sensitive to losses than to gains of the same magnitude. Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good.
It's like the pain of a loss outweighs the pleasure of an equivalent gain. That makes sense. It explains why people might be risk-averse. They're more motivated to avoid losses than to chase gains.
Exactly. Let's revisit the law of demand. It's a fundamental principle in economics stating that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity demanded decreases.
So it's that classic inverse relationship between price and quantity.
Yeah.
People are more likely to buy something if it's cheaper. Are there any exceptions to this rule?
There are. One exception is Veblen Goods. These are luxury items where demand actually increases as the price goes up.
People buy more of something when it gets more expensive? That seems counterintuitive.
Veblen goods are often seen as status symbols. The higher price tag makes them more desirable to certain consumers who want to display their wealth or exclusivity.
It's not just about the inherent value of the good itself, but also about what that price tag signifies. It's like a signal of prestige.
And finally, let's talk about the challenges faced by first movers.
First movers, you mean those companies that enter a new market?
Being a first mover can have its advantages. You get to establish your brand, build a loyal customer base, and potentially capture a large market share. But it also comes with risks.
It's like being a pioneer. You get to explore uncharted territory, but also face the unknown. What are some of those risks?
First movers often have to invest heavily in research and development, educate the market about their new product or service, and deal with the uncertainty of whether it will catch on. They also face the risk that competitors might come along later with a better or cheaper version.
So it's a high-risk, high-reward scenario. They're paving the way for others, but also taking on the brunt of the initial challenges. One last thing that caught my eye is the Laffer Curve. It sounds more like a geometry term than an economic concept.
It's a curve that illustrates the theoretical relationship between tax rates and government revenue. It suggests there's an optimal tax rate that maximizes revenue.
So it's not just a case of the higher the tax rate, the more money the government collects.
At very high tax rates, people might have less incentive to work, invest, or report all of their income. This could lead to a decrease in economic activity and ultimately a decline in tax revenue. The Laffer Curve argues that there's a sweet spot where tax rates are high enough to generate substantial revenue, but not so high that they stifle economic growth.
It's like finding that perfect balance between funding government services and encouraging a thriving economy. It's amazing how economics touches every aspect of our lives.
From the choices we make at the grocery store to the policies that shape our world economics, provides a framework for understanding the forces that drive human behavior and influence our collective destiny.
It's like a secret decoder ring for the world of money markets and human behavior.
Remember, economics is not just for experts or academics. It's a tool everyone can use to make more informed decisions, understand the complexities of the world around us, and contribute to building a better future.
So keep exploring these ideas, stay curious, and never stop questioning the forces that shape our world.
That's a fantastic message to end on. It's been a pleasure diving deep into the world of economics with you.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive, where we'll explore another fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.